Hello, everyone. Welcome to ConnectCon, presented by FTC Team 9794, Wizards.exe. Join us this week on our magical journey each day from 10 to 11 a.m. and 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, where you can hear from STEM professionals from Google, APL, iRobot, and more. My name is Arjun, and I'll be your host for this session. Please use the chat for any questions related to the presentation, and we'll address them at the end. Today, we're honored to have Mr. Alan Nuttle give us a virtual tour of his shop and electronics lab at the Uber Advanced Technologies and talk about his career. Mr. Nuttle is an inventor and formerly worked at Google and Uber. He's been involved with FIRST Robotics since 2004. Thank you, Mr. Nuttle, for taking the time to present at ConnectCon.
Thanks very much for having me. So I have worked at some interesting places. The one that I happen to have photos of was Uber Advanced Technologies, where we did a lot of self-driving. So it was a really neat building, and there's a lot of interesting things there because we had software, we had electronics, and we had mechanical and automotive even. So I'll go through some slides and talk about this, and we'll kind of go from there. Okay, this is just beyond the entrance to our building. They called it the tunnel of the future. They sort of it's got lights all around. It's very white and has little pieces of tech in the window displays. That's the entrance to it in the lobby when you first come into the building. Up above is a conference room. You can see this is a building they sort of wanted to make a statement with, I suppose. It's also sort of in tech. You see a lot of nice buildings, I guess, generally. There's a common area where we would have group meetings. They called it showroom. They could actually put a car down in front. There was room to have a car and have a speaker behind it. So it's sort of a nice prop when you're giving a talk sometimes. Lounge area, more lounge, informal conferencing. That actually overlooks the area for the large meetings. So you can sit there if you want to work through a meeting. There's the cafeteria. We had free food, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and snacks. And there were a lot of like micro kitchens with snacks in different parts of the building. This was sort of the main kitchen. Another sort of conferencing space. I stole these photos off an architecture magazine. The architects for the building did an article on it. This is an area where we could work on the cars inside. So you can't really tell, but there's lifts under those cars. So this is, I tell people, it's the nicest looking garage I've ever been in. Another sort of meeting and relaxation area. This is actually a passage that connects sort of two office spaces that goes over the garage below. And off to the right, you can see there's a very nice conference room, although you can't really tell with the glare on the windows. The main reception area. Here's the front of the building. Okay, so this is sort of transitioning into the shop space. There's one of the self-driving Volvos. You can see the sensor kit up top. You can't see, there's a lot of radars that are in the bumper and so forth that you really don't see. And there's a fairly large compute stack in the back. So this is the shop area. This would be probably of most interest to well, I guess anybody who is interested in mechanical engineering. It's important to know how things are fabricated so you can design them to be manufacturable, and it's just a kind of an interesting technology to me. It's also, if you are doing FRC, there's a lot of opportunity to fab stuff. You don't need this kind of equipment to have a good FRC robot, but it's kind of nice to be able to play around with. This machine puts fasteners into metal, so you can have like a sort of a nut that's integrated into the metal, or a stud that's integrated into the metal. So a lot of pressure in metal sort of acts like clay. So it pushes the stud or the nut into it and forms the metal around it. This is the computer numerically controlled a CNC sheet metal bender, so it can fold all flat metals all kinds of interesting ways. This is a vertical machining center. Oh, sorry, this is the lathe, actually. This is the vertical machine center. So this is a CNC lathe, and you can't really tell very well, but it basically spins a part and then can put tooling on the spinning part. So if you have a part that's mostly radially symmetrical, you might use a lathe to make it. Can machine aluminum. It's subtractive manufacturing. So you start with a big hunk of metal and start carving parts of it away. This is a vertical machining center, so you can see a little bit more inside of this one. There's a spinning tool, and the workpiece is held fixed, and it can move on in 3 axes. The workpiece can move X and Y, and the tooling can move in Z while it's spinning. So you can carve all kinds of things out of metal, it turns out. Aluminum, steels, or plastics too, other metals. This is a smaller machining center. This might be within reach of some schools, or if you have a community college, there's a chance they have a CNC training program and maybe a machine like this one. This is a water jet, can cut flat metal. You can see a piece of metal that's on it. The lighting is not very good, but it's basically, it can cut very thick metals, and there's also either laser cutting or plasma cutting are also sometimes used for that same job. This is just for smoothing pieces of metal. This is a electronics lab, one of the electronics labs we had. Mostly there's storage on the shelves there. And these are just some basic hand tools. This was actually a paint booth, so we can do powder coating. This is another electronics lab. Just different tools that are in there. I should have probably had some overview pictures, but this is what I had. Soldering. Okay, so I think now I'll go through, and before we get into the questions, I'll do just a brief sketch of sort of my career path, you know, through my education, just very, very quickly. Might give people kind of a sense of what to ask about, or maybe they can see themselves in parts of it. So, when I was a kid, the Apollo program was landing people on the moon, which was just really great. I grew up as a teen in the 80s and kind of came up at the same time as computers did. It was definitely the time when it was not cool to be a nerd, but that was pretty much me. Interestingly, I had relatives who were teens when the Wright brothers first flew, and I knew them, and they were still old, but you know, doing well, sharp when we landed on the moon 65 years later. And you know, they were quite old, but I got to talk to them when I was, you know, a young teen. And it's really remarkable, the rate of progress. And it's been something over the trajectory of my career to be a part of that. When I was young, I lived overseas, and I also was very fortunate. I attended the first public residential high school for math and science. And I have a lot of great memories from that. But it wasn't all, you know, I don't have exclusively good memories. We moved around a lot. I was very much an introvert. I went to Carnegie Mellon, and I graduated with degrees in electrical and computer engineering. And not too long after I graduated university, first started, you know, as a small program in New England. I'd really have loved to have been able to participate in first as a student. After I graduated, I started working at a couple of fairly large companies for a few years, and then I was talked into joining a CMU spinoff startup that was pretty influential, although not really well known, but at this day and age. And then I did another startup out of CMU. After that, I worked at Google in technical infrastructure, which is the group. It's a fairly large group. We create the data centers and a lot of the software systems that underpin all of Google's products. So all the web properties, all the backends for all the phone apps, cloud computing, pretty much all of it runs on a common infrastructure. So I was heavily involved in that area. And most recently, I worked for Uber Advanced Technologies, where you saw the pictures on self-driving cars. and I'm currently working for myself as an inventor. Much of my career was focused on software, but also some hardware. It's mostly about ideas, though, for me personally. And I've gotten to lead some fairly large teams and know a lot of very interesting people along the way. With that, if people have questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. And, we'll just sort of see how it goes.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Nuttle, so much for the short presentation. It was still pretty cool to see the shop from Uber. And we've had a couple of questions from the audience and our producer. So I'll start with the question from our producer, Ishan, who asked, how do you come up with your ideas? Because you said you're currently an inventor.
Well, it's interesting. So I think ultimately it's a creative process. So part of that is, giving yourself the freedom to think about things in different ways. I find it largely depends on what I'm thinking about. So I think it helps to have a passion for and strong interest in a certain area. It helps to have, been trained in that area and have aptitude and ability to do things in that area experience. I don't think all inventions are sort of, there is a lot of different kinds of inventions, and it's a little bit hard to generalize, but for me, it's just having a really deep knowledge of the technology and also where the problems are. I think it's been said necessity is the motherhood of invention. So you really have to sort of grapple with problems for a long time for some of these, especially the software technologies where people have been working in the same field for a long time to, come up with something that's really innovative and a real contribution to move things forward. So a lot of it's the work. It's also what Edison said, the inspiration and the perspiration. So, you might have an idea that there's maybe it's some kind of intuitive sense that there's a problem or a solution in this one general area, but you have to spend a lot of time thinking about it to really, and then all of a sudden maybe it just clicks when you're in the shower or something. So it's kind of hard to explain the process, but I think a lot of it's just being immersed in the area where you're trying to come up with something, or maybe you're not even trying to come up with something and it just happens.
Okay, so our next question is, what's the coolest thing you've worked with? Like, what is it, like a really cool machine you've worked with? What's the coolest thing in your opinion?
Well, so I never really got to work on a moonshot literally, but I got to work on some moonshot kind of projects at a couple well-known tech companies, and those were very cool. I have to say it's pretty neat to have a car drive you around the city, but actually the thing that's really in a way most impressive, and it's sort of this iceberg thing where you don't really even see it, but technical infrastructure at Google was really pretty amazing to see. There's some videos you can find or photos from a data center at Google, and it's in fact I might be able to even find those now if somebody wants to spend the time on it, but I'd encourage people to go looking. It's just kind of amazing to see what they call a warehouse scale computer, literally a very large building that's just stuffed full of computers that are all, working to provide, a lot of services that these days are taken for granted. But the scale is just kind of amazing. And these things are measured in units, watt hours of electricity. So power, how much power they consume. And I was at Google at one point. I don't know how many people. It's been a little while. But there's a movie called Back to the Future, and it was 1.21 gigawatts. I think was the amount of energy you needed to make a car time travel in the movie. And I remember the day that Google passed that in data center capacity. So it's just a massive amount of energy. So a lot of things are done to make it energy efficient and not to unnecessarily waste energy. You're basically turning energy into information processing, and you want that to be as efficient as possible. And at the same time, you want to keep adding capacity, and you keep having to reinvent and rebuild the data centers in place too, because computer technology moves very fast. So that was really cool. The self-driving cars are really cool. On another level, I just like poking around in the shop. I'm not a mechanical engineer, but it's really cool to see a piece of metal carved and a really slick looking part come out at the end of it. So I've been fortunate. There's a lot of things I guess I could think of when asked that question.
Okay, so one of the questions we had is why does Uber even have a machine shop? Because the the person in the audience thought that the drivers who like are Uber drivers have their own cars. So why does Uber need to work on cars when the drivers just provide their own?
Sure. Well, that's a good question. I mean, so the part of Uber I was in was all interested in self-driving. So self-driving, you have to have physical cars, and you can't just go out and buy a self-driving car today. So in order to put that sensor kit on the one picture that came through the deck, you have to be able to form metal into different shapes, and you have to do a lot of prototyping, and it's good if you can do that very rapidly. So the main part of Uber really wouldn't need a shop probably, although they prototype little devices for drivers to put in their windows and so forth. The mainline Uber business is very large, and it has a large global footprint. It certainly did before the virus thing came along. And I think there's parts of the world where self-driving won't make economic sense, or with the roads and the other drivers and the economics combined, probably for quite a while. But in dense urban markets in the US, there's actually more demand than supply for drivers. At least there was at the time I was there. And self-driving is seen as a way to improve the safety and to save lives. Uber's arguably saved a lot of lives by reducing things like drunk driving. If you have a robot car, it turns out people are pretty bad drivers, and the robot cars need to be much, much better than people before they'll be socially accepted. And it's just, as an engineer, you don't want to make something that kills somebody, right? I mean, that's just not anybody's idea of a good day at work, right? So the cars have to get to be really, really good. They're already pretty good. In some scenarios, you could probably make statistical arguments they're, better than the typical person. But and it also depends on, which company you're talking about, or which point in time. But there's clearly a lot of interesting things happening there. In my view, self-driving will be a thing. It will happen. It's a little hard to gauge the time frame, but as I say, I don't think it'll happen everywhere at the same rate and scale. But I think there are pilots now that are running self-driving cars in certain settings and doing Uber type trips. So it's here and it's coming. And more broadly, machine learning is very much going to make a large impact. And that's getting to see some of that was another kind of career highlight, I guess, from the previous question.
Okay, so our next question is, have you ever been in the self-driving car, and did you find it scary?
Yeah, I've been in them many times. No, I'm not. I really didn't find it scary. I mean, there was somebody sitting behind the wheel ready to take over. You kind of understand the technology. It's not so much of a black box. If you sort of think about it abstractly in a certain way, what's really scary is the awesome responsibility. I mean, there are instances where your computer program crashes, somebody could die. I mean, this has happened. There are interesting case studies around failures and things like that. But driving a car or a semi truck, which is the other thing where people are working on this, it's fairly terrifying because just the kinetic energy, and that there are people's lives at stake. And so it literally is life and death. And that part of it was scary, the responsibility. The actual experience of being in the car, for the most part, was actually rather boring. They drive very conservatively. They never speed. They never violate traffic rules. So no, I really didn't find it scary. I did get to go on some of the driver training. We had a program where they brought in a bunch of Formula One race drivers to train some of the early vehicle operators in like emergency procedures with cars out on the track, and that was actually kind of fun. Taking some laps in a car with a race driver is far more intense than being in a self-driving car, or driving. Probably people have had more intense experiences driving with their friends sometimes than a typical self-driving car would be. So no, I didn't find it scary at all.
Okay, so follow-up question somewhat is, when do you think self-driving will be a reality in the US? Like, when do you think it's going to be very widespread?
Sure. So if you live around Phoenix, Arizona, Waymo's running self-driving rides now. It's still a fairly small-scale pilot. They happen to have good weather, relatively easy roads. But the thing about self-driving that makes it hard is it's actually easy to say drive a truck down a semi down a freeway, right? 99.99% of the time, it's just stay between the lines. Maybe the lines are faded, but you can tell where the the lines are. The trucks have really good sensors, or the sensors are basically superhuman. So robotics is sense, think, act, and the sensors are already superhuman, right? So you have these sensors that return 3D data, these laser rangefinders, LiDARs that return 3D images of the environment. And your eyes don't really tell you how far something away is. They give you kind of clues that your brain can sort of work out. And you have all these optical illusions when your brain's fooled. And the LiDARs get, raw data that, is pretty not nearly as easy to fool. The ACT part is just the drive-by-wire kind of thing. I mean, most cars have this for adaptive lane keeping, adaptive cruise control, emergency braking. So it's really all the think piece in the middle that's the hard part. And so the think piece is the hard part, and the problem is getting enough nines where you're safe enough. And you really want 100%, but it's really hard to do 100% at pretty much anything. So, you get maybe a few orders of magnitude safer than humans, and you're going to not roll that out will cost lives, right? But rolling it out, maybe somebody will die still at some point because of a problem. The thing you have to worry about is you're running a fleet of these things. You don't want to buy it. All of a sudden, one day somebody rolls out a software release and bad things start happening everywhere. But anyway, as for the time frame, I would say, I think you will see within 5 years, the 5-year kind of range, you'll start seeing fairly large scale deployments becoming not routine, but not, big news events just by themselves. I think until it becomes widespread in the US is probably more like at least 10 and maybe even 15 or 20 years. And then in parts of the world, I couldn't even guess. I mean, it depends. If the economics get really good and the cars can get to where they can handle some of the situations you see in other places. Driving is not exactly the same everywhere, but when you do the sort of long tail things of the ball bounces in the street and the kid runs after it kind of thing. I mean, those kinds of things you have to be able to handle everywhere. One of the big problems is if you're really conservative in some places, the way other drivers go, you'll just basically never move. And so, that's safe, but well, it's maybe not good if you're obstructing traffic. It's not totally safe, but it's not a real solution to the problem. So it will be a range. I don't think it's just going to be like, one day there's no self-driving and the next day there's total self-driving. With trucking, maybe long haul trucks will come within 5 years too. And that could be a pretty big thing. And like with many other things in technology, there's, potentially bad things displacing truck drivers, but also good things, maybe more, they don't have to stop and rest. Automated self-driving trucks, they can probably get better fuel efficiency, things like this.
Okay, so one of our audience members asked, what do you mean by enough nines?
So the idea is that, you really want to get to 100%, but 90% would be 1 9. 99% would be 2 nines, 99.9 would be 3 nines. So, how many, if you're 99.99999, it's basically how many nines do you need to be safe. And there's a lot of metrics you can do on this. I mean, if you're just talking about freeway miles, it's different. If you're talking about running an Uber in San Francisco or New York City, you might not rack up as many miles, but they're much more interesting or eventful miles. So it's kind of hard to put safety in a single metric, but just that, I guess that's a phrase that sort of is sort of an allusion to safety. Get it safe enough is maybe another way of putting it, with the acknowledgement that safe enough is going to need to be, really, really safe. So that's the idea is, maybe 6 nines is, that's actually a kind of number that it's you're there's a certain number of nines sort of being hit by lightning or winning a lottery or something like that. And, you know, when you start talking about things like, you know, 5, 6 nines, you're well beyond that.
Okay, so one of our audience members again asked, what's the signal to noise ratio in LiDAR operation?
LiDAR is actually somewhat better than, say, like a camera. The issue with a camera is you just get this whole, you know, tessellation of pixels. And so, you know, there's a lot of data. LiDAR, the way it works is you have some number of lasers that are inclined at different angles. Well, there's different ones. The traditional LiDAR, it spins these beams around, kind of like old time radars used to have a spinning antenna that you could kind of watch go around. And what you get back is a point cloud. And so there's a certain number of points that cover, you know, basically a cylinder 360 degrees around you. And what you get back at every point is how far away it was until you got a return, or maybe you didn't get any return. And you do get things like, you know, you can have a fog, you can get returns off of fog, or, you know, maybe a chain link fence where you get some returns, but not, you know, sometimes the beam will go through and sometimes it will be reflected. So the data is hard to process. I mean, you don't get totally clean data back, but relative to things like cameras, LiDARs are pretty clean. Other sensors like radars, at least historically, have been lower resolution. So they might not be super clean either, but you get lower resolution, and you also can get back Doppler effects. So you can tell with a radar return, you can tell not only is there an object at a certain distance, but you can tell something about the relative velocity. So maybe the car in front of you is hitting its brakes, which is nice information to have. So with self-driving, a lot of it is getting a lot of different kinds of sensors, which again speaks to being sort of superhuman sensors. But it is true, the better the sensors are, the more information they're returning. You know, a lot of that ultimately is uninteresting. And one of the things your brain's really good at is discarding uninteresting information. It turns out your eyes, if you look at how they work in detail, there's a fairly small part called the fovea that's really high resolution. And most of the rest of your eye doesn't have anywhere near that resolution, but it can detect motion really well. And your eyes sort of automatically, or your eyes and your brain, your nervous system, can automatically move the high resolution, the fovea, to be looking at the part, you know, where something interesting is happening. And so getting a lot of signal back that contains a lot of noise, you have to do a lot of processing to get rid of the noise. And machine learning is a really useful technique for that. In fact, when I was logging into Zoom today, there's this thing called a reCAPTCHA, which I'm sure people know about. It came from Carnegie Mellon, so I don't know if everybody knows about it, but it's basically it's meant to tell if you're some kind of automated you know, software that's trying to log into a website or a real person. And today when I was logging in, it was showing a lot of images that are basically self-driving. It was like, you know, click all the traffic lights or click all the tractors. And so machine learning, you're really, a lot of it's curating very large data sets. And so basically, you know, reCAPTCHA there is one way you can crowdsource, you know, getting some kind of human labeling of image data. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And, you know, probably if I hadn't worked in self-driving, I'd just be like, okay, whatever, you know. It's used to be they wanted me to sort of read funny little cursive letters that were sort of obfuscated in different ways. And then it was like, read street numbers. Well, that turns out to be useful for Street View, right? So if you're Google and you're driving Street View vans around and you want to be able to have maps that have numbers on all the buildings, it's really good to be able to have a machine read numbers off of houses or whatever off of image data. And in fact, Google does have very good machine learning models that can do that. And one of the ways that helped to get there was having a lot of data from Street View drives, and then, you know, having some kind of human QA on the data so that you can use it for training. The data doesn't necessarily do you a lot of good unless you have some reliable information about what's actually in the data. And so this is, machine learning is a really good way to cut that down. LiDAR better than cameras, but still there is a lot of noise at times, and machine learning seems to be the best way to deal with that for the most part. There's a lot of image processing with cameras you can do also. It's a pretty complicated field, so I don't mean to give such a a long evasive answer, but LiDAR is a pretty good sensor, really, as it turns out.
Yeah, so I think one of our audience members asked, what does LiDAR sense? And then another asked, how does it work in like rain or snow? Because there's like a lot of different particles around.
Sure. So the basic idea with LiDAR is it's a time of flight measurement. So you're sending out some kind of modulated laser beam, and there's different ways, but the simplest model is just has, you pulse a laser, and then you're actually timing how long it takes to reflect back. So the further away things are, it's essentially sort of a cylindrical, instead of a fixed number of pixels and whatever distance the image is at, you always see the same number of pixels. Here you have a fixed number of data points you're going to get, but instead of being pixels, they really are points, because the laser it's coherent, it stays pretty tight. So the further away you are, essentially the points get spaced further out, which happens with pixels too, but pixels tend to do this averaging thing, whereas the laser pulses don't do that. But if the pulse bounces off something, it depends on how reflective it is. If it's black and it's far away, you might get a weak return. But anyway, you'll get some return, and this is one of the things that limits the range on a LiDAR. But the laser pulse is sent out, bounces back, and you time that, and that gives you a distance. And then there are different ways of steering the beam. Some of them use mechanical placement of multiple lasers and an actually spinning piece. Others work with different technologies. But the general idea is they're all doing time of flight on a laser beam. And then what was the second part? It was oh, and they're infrared light, by the way, so you don't normally see them. And they're moving so fast they don't hurt your eyes. So there's anytime you have lasers, there's safety concerns with eye safety. And then the second part, I think I remember it, but maybe you could repeat it for me.
It was, how do LiDARs work in rain or snow?
Oh, rain or snow, right, yeah. So those can potentially be problematic. You can get returns off raindrops or snow. If you're a person and you're driving in rain or snow, you've seen where it can obscure your vision and make it harder to drive. And your headlights, if you're in fog or rain or snow, you can get reflections off your headlights, which cause more glare. So this is why fog lights are a thing, and why you might turn your high beams off, under certain conditions to avoid this. So this is one of the challenges. So, all these sensors have different failure modes. Extreme glare of the sun might be another one, or what happens when all the cars have LiDARs and everybody's shooting laser beams at everybody else. So you have to actually engineer all of these things to handle all of these things. And if you can't, if there's bad enough snow, maybe the right answer, and this applies to people too, maybe the right answer at times is to pull over and put on your hazards, pull over somewhere safe and put on your hazards. With self-driving, you don't have to operate in cities where you have snow, or times of the year when you have snow, or days when you have snow. I mean, if you're somebody like Uber and you're running a self-driving fleet that's overlaid on a human fleet, you can just let the humans take over. And, maybe down the line, sensors get better. It's not so much that snow or rain are impossibilities. It's just another dimension to an already hard problem. So this is one of the reasons why I think, Phoenix is probably the first place you've seen cars that, really have no operator in them, that are running around autonomously. The weather's favorable. So rain and snow can be issues. It depends. A little bit of rain, no big deal. A torrential rain that would cause a problem for a human, you need the data, and you need to train your ML on those kinds of data sets. And for the most part, people are focused on things that, sort of exclude those. And so sensors will continue getting better, and the data sets and training will get better. And then I think that's a solvable problem, but it's sort of a secondary problem. If you're in an autonomous car and it happens to start snowing really bad, you won't maybe think of it as a secondary problem, but the way that that's initially going to be dealt with, I think, is just by precluding that from happening, by not running self-driving cars in places and times where that's going to happen.
Okay. What's your biggest piece of advice to high school and college students that want to pursue engineering?
Yeah, so advice is good. So asking for advice is also good. Being aware that, you can, talking to somebody who's been down the same path, or one of the things when you're young is there's many different places you might go, right? So every choice you make, you're sort of implicitly not choosing a lot of other directions you might go. And so it is good to talk to people who've kind of been there maybe a few years ahead of you and get their perspective, talk to people you respect who've done very well. So a lot of it I actually think is getting advice, because it very much depends on your specifics. If you want to go into that, there's a lot of demand, and you know, that was a good choice for me, for sure. I think it's a good choice for a lot of people. A lot of demand, and these seem to be pretty secure jobs, you know, and you know, as you look towards the future, it's always hard to forecast the future, but I think it's a good career choice. If you like a lot of things you encounter at first, that's, you know, that's a pretty good sign. And I think if you can do something you're passionate about and you seem to, you know, do well at, then you're, you know, pretty likely to have, you know, one degree of success or another. And so I really think it's good to talk to other people. It makes you, you know, when you have to put your own thoughts and feelings into words, it can help you, you know, sort of with this internal dialogue that helps you reason about these things. I really think that's a very good question. I think, you know, make good use of your time. The time when you're young is, you know, there's this time value of all these things. So I think another part of it is, as you come out of high school and sort of into university and things, it becomes more on you. The peers you surround yourself with aren't, you know, like they lived in the same spot and were the exact same age. And you get more responsibility. You know, do you skip class? Do you go to class? What classes do you sign up for? You know, do you sort of deliberately go out and engage people with different perspectives? Do you surround yourself with people who are, you know, good influencers and you know, spend their time, you know, productively? I mean, you know, you should have fun at different stages in life too. You should enjoy what you're doing and everything. But the age that a lot of people are at as they're coming through and out of first, you know, you're kind of making all these major life decisions. And in a funny way, you're kind of the least qualified you'll ever be to make those decisions. I mean, maybe if you go back 5 years and you think, well, a lot's changed with you in the last 5 years. I mean, you know, that's a time of a lot of growth, but, you know, think what it might be like 5 years in the future. It's also the, you know, you might look back and just have the same sort of sense. So I really do think seeking out advice is a good thing. And it's hard to generalize. I mean, I think manage your time well, find something that you're passionate about and have an aptitude for, and don't get discouraged. I mean, you know, there are people at college who are taking easier programs, and maybe it seems like, you know, that's might be some things about that kind of a choice that seems desirable, but you know, you get to really make a positive impact in a lot of things as an engineer or a scientist, and your mind will be busy, which for me, that's you know, to be engaged and doing things that are interesting. You know, if I had to be doing something that just was, you know, very rote and boring, and you know, for many years of a career, I think that would be just I just almost can't even imagine it. So I'd encourage people to pursue that course, and you know, it's good to talk with people about that. It'll help you form your decision and decide if it's the right thing for you or not. I mean, you have options when you're young, but you know, as you invest time in university, you know, again, you preclude certain options or make it harder to change direction. But, you know, don't be afraid when you're young. If it seems clear that that's the thing to do, talk it over with people and do that. But yeah, I'm very happy that I went into engineering.
Okay. So earlier, you mentioned that you did 2 startups, or you were in 2 startups before you went into Google and Uber. What were those 2 startups for? What did they do?
Sure. One was basically in the early 90s, a lot of businesses still ran everything on these mainframe computers. And the notion that you had a distributed network of computers or a cluster, the internet was a very new thing. I had email before probably 98, 99% of people in the world had heard of it at Carnegie Mellon. And coming out of there, You know, the whole data center thing that I talked about, it's kind of a giant mainframe, but it's made up of a whole bunch of, you know, more or less commodity PCs. And so the first startup I was at was involved in that kind of technology. We had a lot of really big online financial services were running on our stuff, or some of the first very large websites were running on our stuff, because it was stuff that needed more than one computer to you know, to take off a mainframe, or more than one computer to serve enough, you know, web traffic. So it was, and at the time that was very revolutionary, very groundbreaking. So a lot of the programming paradigms that you know are popular today kind of you can trace roots back to there. And a lot of the people that I had as colleagues there, you know, gone on and seeded a lot of other companies. So that was really, really neat. I was very fortunate to be in that place. It was, I very much think of it as a kind of continuation of my education, and it was good for networking and just, you know, if you can be somewhere like that, and it's sometimes hard to know ahead of time that that's what something's going to turn out to be. Maybe only when you look back do you realize it. But that was really fortunate. The second startup was in storage, which has also become pretty, you know, the amount of data that's kept in computers and stored has just gone up, you know, exponentially or higher rate. And so it's hard to manage that kind of data, that amount of data, to take it all in and keep it and not lose track of it, and to organize it and so forth. So the second startup I was at was in that space, and I had a lot of colleagues from both of those who wound up, you know, going to save Google, and so it was all pretty much computers. Those two were software. Prior to that, I worked primarily in hardware, but a lot of the action kind of shifted to software. So those are really good experiences.
Okay, so what sorts of projects are you working on right now, and how many projects do you work on simultaneously?
So I have a couple of different patents in the pipeline, so I guess you maybe count that as two projects. I'm also, you know, talking to companies about trying to license them. A lot of companies don't like to read patents, especially in software. Patents are kind of a funny thing in the area of software. One of mine's in software, and sort of deliberately one of the ones I'm working on currently isn't. I do a decent amount with FRC. So that was, but that's kind of been shut down. So that project is sort of on hiatus. And I do some consulting, but that's also been pretty quiet of late. So I've kind of had some downtime. Other times in the past, you know, when I was working at a company, I've been tech lead of you know, sometimes 3, 4, 5 different groups at a time, and you know, being involved in all those. When I started out, you know, it was mostly, you know, okay, here you're part of this one project. But as I was at one of the startups that went through a tremendous growth phase, and so you know, I wound up being, you know, early 20s and having, you know, 50, 60 people reporting to me, and they were in, you know, 2 or 3 countries, and several different groups, different parts of the project. The product line that the company had, I had projects in several different areas. So it's been as high as 5 or 6, and it's been as low as 1. It just varies over time, really.
Okay, so what does it mean to be a software inventor? Because hardware inventor create things that you can like hold in your hands, but what do software inventors create?
So that's a good question. There's been some lawyers who've had a lot to say about that. Actually, Google sort of was not very. I think there was this. There was something called a patent troll at one point. Software moves very fast, and patents are 20 years. And the funny thing with computers and software is that a lot of times it's the same idea coming around again, but maybe slightly reframed, or you know, there are revolutionary things that come along from time to time, but then sometimes, you know, you find an antecedent that, you know, is pretty clear, but you know, it's still a new thing. So if you invent something with software, which you might do in the context of a patent, and you really invented something in quotes, versus if you're working as a software engineer somewhere. I mean, you're inventing something every day. It's like writing a book, maybe, is a good analogy. I mean, there's a certain grammar and a certain language and certain rules, and maybe there's different genres, or I don't want to overextend the analogy, but it's ultimately a creative process when you're writing code that will solve problems, and you may not have something tangible to hold in your hand at the end of the day, but on the other hand, you make a code change, and all of a sudden, millions of users have the thing that you did, and they may not even know it, but they have the thing that you did, or you did in collaboration with others, and it's doing something that they value, and making revenue for your employer or the company or your enterprise. And so it's not necessarily that different. I mean, it maybe has aspects of being an author that you might also think of with mechanical inventions or electrical inventions, but I think ultimately these are all creative processes. But there's also a lot of, it's the inspiration, perspiration thing again, too.
Okay, so another question is, what sorts of things did you do or did you work on which are involved with FIRST?
So I worked, I raised 4 sons, and so when they were the first time I got involved with FLL, it was when one of the younger ones, his school had a team. So I was just all over that. It was like the coolest thing ever. And then I remember going to the event. It was just I'd coached soccer and taken my kids to all kinds of sporting events and everything, and it was just really very refreshing, and it just resonated with me. So I strongly believed in the program. I really never thought of FIRST as beyond FLL until actually my youngest son, when he was in high school, they started an FRC team, and I came to help out with that. He came home and started telling me about it, and I thought that was just great. So we had a lot of good experiences together with that, and I really enjoyed it. So I was a mentor for that team, and then he graduated, and I kept mentoring that team. And his high school was right near Carnegie Mellon, so I helped Carnegie Mellon start a team. They actually didn't have one, but they wound up starting an all-girls team. So I had 4 sons, so that was sort of a new experience for me in a way. And so I guess the next thing, I was sort of a serial mentor with FRC teams, and I got to where I was really too busy to be a full-time lead mentor, and I think I'd like to get back to that someday, actually. But I switched kind of to volunteering, so I do mainly at FRC events. I do something called Control System Advisor, which is we wear these orange hats so we're easy to find, and if people have trouble with the robot, the control system, or the software, or connecting to the field or whatever, we help troubleshoot those kinds of problems. And the other thing is, I got wind of FIRST Global right when it was sort of starting up, or at least before they had their inaugural event. So there have been one of those in Washington, D.C., one in Mexico City, and one in Dubai, UAE. And I've been to all those, and that's been a lot of fun, very gratifying. So it's a chance to work. And those robots are kind of like FTC, but the program, it's very much an international program, and so it's in some ways it's very much like FTC, but in other ways it's kind of a different thing, and that's been really fun to do too. So and this year with all the events canceled, they've sort of done this remote judging of sort of like video submissions and little technical challenges and things like that. So I've been judging those as well, but hopefully next year we'll be back, and I'll go to wherever they have the event next year, and also help out with FRC.
Okay, so did Uber allow FTC or FRC teams to use their machine shop or get parts made there?
They have an awesome shop for that. It would just be great to have them as a sponsor. They did have some FIRST teams in and sort of do real tours instead of virtual tours, and that sort of thing. there's safety, liability, insurance type things with having students in the shop. So, I guess what you'd really need to do is get some people in the shop as mentors and have them make parts on your behalf, and then combine that maybe with a tour. They never really did, and I'm not there now, so I can't speak for them. I think they may have been asked in the past, and it just didn't work out. One of the other things, Google was really great about supporting FIRST. Google.org gives a lot of money to FIRST every year, so I tried pretty hard to get Uber along those lines. I had some success, but it's tough when you're a pre-IPO and you're not profitable. So I can sort of see both sides of that. So if Uber does well as a business, going forward, maybe they're worth talking to from that standpoint. But I think in general, in the past, they have not done that.
Okay. Do you think that self-driving cars, along with non-self-driving cars, on the road will be a safety issue? Because there's some interesting drivers on the road.
Yeah, right. So this is kind of a special case of, I think, what's sometimes known as the uncanny valley problem, right? So if it's all people, then it is what it is. We're familiar with that scenario. If it's all self-driving, I mean, some people talk about having the cars communicate with each other and not needing stop signs and everything. And if it's all automated, you might imagine scenarios where you get like that. This transition period in the middle, if indeed it is a transition and ever goes to where you don't have human drivers, because as long as there's one, you can't take away the stop signs or the lights, especially, and you have to be able to deal with it. But you have pets wandering in the road and kids wandering in the road, and all kinds of things that you still have to deal with. So in a way, it's good that you have this sort of worst case scenario when you're starting out, because it forces you to really solve the problem and not sort of cheat it by having the vehicles cooperate. Is it unsafe? I think the case where you have all people is arguably pretty unsafe. If you look at the statistics, I mean, they're pretty horrendous. The number of people who die in traffic accidents or get severely maimed. I mean, there's whole industries around insurance and lawsuits and a lot of medical things that happen from this. People get life-altering injuries. So I think the current scenario is pretty unsafe. The transition period, I don't think society will tolerate it being more unsafe in terms of the outcomes, statistically what happens in terms of injuries, deaths, and wrecks. So I think what you will see as it rolls out, the more automated, the safer it gets. And if it's not, that's going to put the brakes on it rolling out. So, and I think everybody knows that. So there's a lot of pressure to make sure that doesn't happen. Having said that, these are complicated, systems that people engineer, and if you study the history of technology, there's lots of case studies you can put your finger on where unexpected things have happened or bad things have happened, and when it's at scale, that's what's even more terrifying. So this is yet another reason why I think it'll roll out, relatively slowly. On the other hand, you see people like Tesla, and they've rolled out autopilot pretty aggressively. And, there have been some pretty widely reported, adverse outcomes where people have died even in a couple of cases. But statistically, fewer people died than if they'd been driving themselves. So, I mean, it's a tough thing. And, people will argue all day over statistics, right? So you have to source everything, and it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, there's an emotional angle to it that statistics don't speak to. And it's like, okay, I bought a car, I'm in control, maybe everybody else is a bad driver and I have some risk of dying, but I'm a good driver, and, I'm not ever going to be temporarily distracted or, have a blowout and I can't, I was driving too fast and I can't, tree was in the wrong place. I mean, there's things happen, but, people have trouble, sort of detaching themselves and being objective enough to see things at that level, and rightly so. I mean, at least if I'm driving and I cause myself to die, it's on me, right? If I bought something and spent a lot of money and it causes, me to die, that's product liability, and not, nobody. That's just, somehow far worse, even if the odds are lower. And I'm not trying to say that, these are easy closed things that, have already been decided and there's no point talking about them or these are absolute facts. I mean, the whole area is really complicated by the fact the stakes are very high. I mean, driving is a big thing. You know, lots of cars do lots of miles, and you know, these are very visible, severe consequences. And so all these things are reasons why it's going to take longer to roll out, but rightly so. And I think at the end of the day, again, by the time it rolls out, it will have to be far safer than people, or it's just not going to happen. And that includes the transition, I think.
Okay. And one last question before we end is, one of our audience members was asking to talk about any like special algorithms or techniques used to ensure the shortest response time, because when you're driving, you need to be able to like respond to different situations very quickly.
That's right. Yeah. Well, that's there. I could talk for probably at least an hour on just that, right? So you have a lot of data coming from sensors. Sometimes the scenes get busier and there's more data. Hopefully, if that happens and the busy stuff is closer, you're driving slower. But yeah, ultimately, you have to be able to manage the worst case scenario. So you have like, you know, the worst set of inputs coming from the sensors that you have to do the most processing on, and reaction time, just like with people, is a thing. And you have a budget with reaction time. Like, you know, part of it is how long do the brakes take to stop the vehicle. Part of it is how long does the computer, when it tells the brakes to start going on, you know, till they go on. And you actually pick up, you know, it turns out computers can do that kind of thing faster than people, and you can build you know, braking systems that are pretty good, you know, ABS brakes and whatnot. So you get some win there in being able to beat human reaction time. But the think part, again, and again, it's in the worst case scenarios. Maybe it's, you know, again, the snow or rain. You know, you imagine as a person, you're never going to go 60 miles an hour when there's, you know, obscured visibility, and, you know, there's like, you know, concert letting out and people are, you know, jumping across the street, and you're in a downtown setting where, you know, there's intersections and stop signs and stoplights. So it is very much a case that you need almost like a hard real-time guarantee on certain reaction times, you know, from the first time the sensor picks something up until you can act on it. And part of that's prioritization, being able to shed, you know, work. Like, just to give you an example, maybe you have an audio sensor that's listening for ambulance sirens or something, and things get really busy. Maybe you defer that processing for a while, or, you know, you just maybe just ignore the audio sensor for a while until you have some spare CPU cycles. But it also means you have to optimize and make things efficient. You have to iterate. And initially, this is one of the drivers for, I mentioned the one car I showed a picture of had a fairly large compute stack in the back. This is part of it, especially while the software is under development. You don't want to be constrained by the hardware footprint you have, the amount of CPU cycles, the amount of GPU cycles, and so on. So you basically, you know, way over provision that, and then over time, once you have the problem solved, you can optimize and shrink. And a lot of that is in something like a website, you have a certain response time on average, but the one response time they really care about is called like the P99 or the P99.9. So if 0.1% of your web queries take longer than a certain amount, this is a bad experience, and you really would much rather knock those down than, you know, maybe take a millisecond off of the average or whatever, even if knocking those down doesn't even take a millisecond off the average. And so it's a little bit like that. You have to worry about all these kinds of things. And self-driving, there's a lot of literally moving parts, right? The vehicle's moving, the people are out there moving, other vehicles are moving, and it's all real time. And if you have any kind of lag in processing sensor data, I mean, imagine if you were driving down the road and somehow your eyes were laggy. Like, you know, maybe you're watching a video and your computer's, you know, putting a half-second delay in before you know, you're actually seeing the road. I mean, you know, this is not safe. So there's a lot of ways where you could have the right answer, and a lot of things you do with computation. If you get the right answer, it's not so important if it took, you know, 4 minutes or 5 minutes maybe. But something like self-driving, I mean, you know, it's milliseconds count. So there's a whole lot there that could be talked about, but not in, you know, I almost don't even know where to start with that one. But yeah, it is a very good question, and it's definitely a thing. And it's one of the big problems that has to be solved to have a safe system.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Is there anything else you'd like to say to the audience, Mr. Nuttle?
No, just thanks. I appreciate people's time, and good luck when events start back up. We're all hoping that comes sooner rather than later.
Well, if you have any more questions regarding the presentation, or you're watching this recorded and have a question, please email them to us at wizards.exe@gmail.com, which is, by the way, in the description, and we'll forward them to Mr. Nuttle. ConnectCon continues tomorrow with 2 sessions. In the morning, Mr. Saul Schaefer will be speaking about bioengineering, and in the afternoon, Mr. Paul Bierman will be conducting a virtual tour of the JHU APL Advanced Mechanical Fabrication Lab. If you'd like to be informed about more events and videos by our team, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and check out our website. Thank you so much, Mr. Nuttle, for presenting at ConnectCon. Thank you, everyone, for presenting today. Or thank you, everyone in the audience, for actually attending today and being so attentive. And thank you to our alumni, Sarthak Bhatnagar, Angeline Zhang, and Ishana O'Bray for their help. See you all tomorrow.